We will now begin our session, Pakistani English Literature, New Books, New Writers, New Directions. Our speakers for this session are Ilona, Yusuf. Kanza, Javed, Khalique, Sophia Khan, and Aroosa Kanwal. Our moderator for this session is Muneeza Shamsie. Muneeza Shamsie is a writer, critic, and bibliographer and the author of Hybrid Tapestries, The Development of Pakistani Literature in English, and managing editor of a work in progress, The Oxford Companion to the Literatures of Pakistan. Her extensive work includes 3 pioneering anthologies of Pakistani English literature, and she is a regular contributor to Dawn and Newsline. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I will introduce my panelists very briefly. You can see their full CVs in the booklet. Beginning from my extreme left, that Aroosa Kanwal is Assistant Professor of English Literature at the International Islamic University, Islamabad. And she's the author of Rethinking Identities in Contemporary Pakistani Fiction Beyond 9/11, which was launched yesterday. Her current interests include post-9/11 constructions of Muslims and Islam in relation to Islamophobic discourse, politics of representations, and questions of migrations, borders, and identity. Kanza Javed received degrees from the University of Massachusetts and the University of Arizona, and she's the author of a first novel, Ashes, Wine, and Dust, which was shortlisted for the Tiber Jones Award for South Asian fiction. That's for books that are as yet unpublished. Sophia Khan was born in Islamabad, and she was educated or received degrees from Haverford College and Sarah Lawrence College, and she has written her first novel, Yasmin, and a couple of weeks ago she was also shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Short Story Prize. To my right we have Ilona Yusuf, who is a distinguished printmaker and poet and author of a poetry collection, Picture This, and she's guest edited a special issue of Pakistani poetry for the Canadian journal Vallum, and is also co-editor of a new literary journal in Pakistan, Alif. And to my extreme right, there's Khalique, who has actually published several collections of poetry in Urdu, including the award-winning Mela Mein, and he's also the author of several English language poetry collections. And he's written creative nonfiction and was a fellow of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Pakistani English literature has been long in gestation, and well, it begins from pre-Raj times, but we got a sort of new contemporary voice emerging in the 1960s. Actually, it really began with poetry, with people like Tawfiq Rafat and Maki Qureshi and Zulfikar Ghaus in the diaspora, who also wrote the first sort of contemporary Pakistani English novel in the 1960s. And then there's a gap of about 13 years, and then you get this new generation with Babsi Sitwa making a mark as a fiction writer, Hanif Qureshi in the diaspora with his drama, Sara Suleri with her introducing, in fact, the creative memoir into Pakistani English literature. And that was the beginning. And then you have this sudden outpouring of literary forms in English, including poetry, fiction, and drama, although drama is almost entirely in the diaspora. And you've got new writers emerging every day. As Aroosa said yesterday, there's a strong body of fiction written by writers of Pakistani origin which revolves around 9/11. That includes people like Nadeem Aslam, Uzma Aslam Khan, Mohsin Hamid, and Kamla Shamsi, and H.M. Naqvi. And you've got other writers, including these, all these writers and others have actually expanded the parameters of the Pakistani English novel. For example, Muhammad Hanif has written the first political satire in Pakistani English fiction. Moni Mohsin and Mahar Khan Phillips have expanded social satire. And you've got a whole lot of debut novelists like Bilal Tanveer, Fatima Bhutto, Sonia Kamal. And you've got Saad Shafqat, who wrote the first medical thriller. Umar Shahid Hamid, who wrote the first police thriller. And the subjects covered by the fiction, and in fact Pakistani English literature generally is very diverse. You've got a lot of work on 1971, you've got a lot of work on racial politics, on life in the diaspora, or working class life in the diaspora. And the short fiction has been rather more quiet, but then it sort of comes in with Amir Hussain, who tries intertextual engagements with Urdu literature, and now he's actually writing Urdu fiction. He's moved from English to Urdu, and now he's translating the Urdu into English. And then you have the enormous success of Danyal Muinuddin's short stories, Jamil Ahmed's short stories about Baluchistan, and all this has been going on with a lot of publicity, but poetry has been kind of rather marginalized, although we've actually had some really very good poetry. We've got Imtiaz Dharkar won the Queen's Award for Poetry, which kind of made history. She's the first South Asian to have won this award, which has been given to really major writers in the Commonwealth. And then you've got Muneeza Alvi, who's very well known. Then over here we've had people like Waqas Khwaja and Athar Tahir, who've been working steadily throughout the 90s and right up to the present day. But you had new voices like Ilona here, Haris, Kaila Pasha, and Hima Raza. And Hima Raza was again very interesting because she wrote experimental poetry, which was half in English and half in Urdu. And now you've got a new direction with Shadab Zist Hashmi, who's writing qasidas and ghazals in English. In drama, it's all happening in the diaspora, but briefly, you've got, you know, Hanif Qureshi made a great mark when he was nominated for an Oscar nomination in the 1980s. And now you've got Ayad Akhtar, who's received the Pulitzer Prize for Disgraced, which interrogates contemporary American class, faith, ethnicity. Well, and then we've got, in our very miss, in our daily miss, we've got new types of essays that are being actually written in our newspapers. You know, Salman Rashid's travel writing, Moni Mohsin and Jugnu Mohsin's satire. And you've got new autobiographies. We're going to address, I think, what happened to the literary essay. But the question, I'm going to begin with my question is, first of all, I'll address Ilona, Haris, and Aroosa, and ask them to speak briefly in turn on how do you perceive Pakistani English literature today, and what new directions is it taking? Shall we begin this way? We begin with Haris, okay? Haris.
What? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Muneeza. And thank you all for being here. It's a very distinguished audience with Dr. Tariq Rahman present, because with his book on, you know, the tracing the history of Pakistani English writing until the 1988, Dr. Saab, isn't it? I think that was my first book about which I read, which was about, you know, what was happening in Pakistan before us. I was familiar with Wordfall and some other writings and occasional pieces because Muneeza Appa started collecting and compiling and criticizing work around that time, you know, in terms of book form. Otherwise, you know, there were other writers. I think it is taking new directions, but I would like to caution the audience and the people present that English writing in Pakistan, and I can say that because I'm a little familiar as a reader with what is happening in other languages, is one. Now we have to understand and establish that English is one of the Pakistani languages. So that has to be recognized. So it is not an alien language in which people are writing or experimenting or expressing their thoughts and feelings. So that, so that debate is not anymore valid in Pakistan. One is that. But the other thing is that English is not the only representative language of Pakistani literature. That I think is important but there are people in the audience who come from other countries, and so English is one of our languages, but not the sole representative language. So there's a lot of interesting, actually in case of Urdu and Sindhi for that matter, a lot in terms of volume as well as quality. There's very good writing that keeps appearing. And in other languages also, which I couldn't mention, 10 or 12 Pakistani languages. So I think that is important. In terms of new directions, there's an emergence of new fiction writers and poets. Unfortunately, poets are not. We live in the age of fiction, as I call it. So poets are not. I mean, they're admired but not celebrated as much as works of fiction are in this age and time. But there's a lot happening in poetry also. If you're familiar with this biannual magazine Paper Cuts, which was some young Pakistani writers brought out recently, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, I believe. Three issues have come out, and then there are other initiatives like Alhambra Review, which Ilona, sitting on my left, she edited I think one or two editions, and then there is another journal I think from the Kanwal College, Pakistan Center for English Writing, which is about to be launched. But we will discuss about that, Muneeza Appa, that what is happening with the literary journals and why there is they can't sustain themselves once. So there is a lot happening in poetry. There's a lot happening in fiction, and interestingly, in Urdu and other Pakistani languages, novel is not or couldn't establish itself as a genre as much as short fiction did. And there are a host of reasons for that. But in Pakistani English fiction, something really fascinating that has happened is that many of our new writers or younger writers have actually expanded the horizons. Not just that, in terms of thinking in new ways and experimenting with new ideas and thoughts, but they have also contributed substantially to Pakistani fiction per se. And that is something which needs to be celebrated. I'm not suggesting that there was no Qurratul Ain Haider or Abdullah Hussain or Bano Qudsiya or Shamsur Rahman Farooqi if you cross the border, and people who have been writing fiction in Urdu. But given the number of people that speak and write in the language, leave alone the people who the question about how many native speakers we have and how many people use it as a second language, but just the sheer number of people. So novel hasn't really been established in Pakistan as such before people started writing in English. I've been very long, so I stop here, and then we can come back to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and especially the point about the many languages. Ilona?
Well, I'm better with poetry than with any other genre because I do read novels, but not as much as I read poetry. I think what's happening that is new is it kind of goes in tandem with the fact that there is a lot more, although still very little, in the way of platforms for people to publish or read their work. So as you pointed out, Muneeza, in the 70s it was a very vibrant time for poetry, and that kind of died out during the 80s. And in the 90s, that kind of resurfaced, and I think Alhambra Publishing was a key element in that, because Alhambra published a lot of young writers, and that includes Hima Raza. And Hima was probably the first one to actually start experimenting with different forms. And one of that included bilingual poems. So, and in her bilingual poems, like half the poem will be in Urdu, half in English, and even in Urdu script. And when you read the poem, then it may be about love, but the English version is, it explores love in a very different way from the Urdu version, which is very much written in a modern form, but with the Urdu sensibility of romantic love. Then you come to the 2000s, and again here I'd like to emphasize that, you know, we have no platforms, you know, either from the state. We have the Pakistan Academy of Letters anthology, but it's, you know, that's the only thing there, or was the only thing there. Now we have the online journals, the Missing Slate and Desi Writers Lounge, which have been very, very instrumental in bringing out new writers, new poets, as well as fiction or prose writers. And that has done an enormous amount for them, because they have conducted workshops and they have put poets in touch with one another. So while those circles are very small, they're very, very important, because they allow poets to be in touch and to critique one another's work. As far as developments in poetry are concerned, I would say that, like poets like Shadab Aziz Hashmi are doing very new things. Not new perhaps in America, because the ghazal, for instance, in English was widely used and encouraged by Agha Shahid Ali, and a lot of American poets did write ghazals, but those ghazals were more modernized, those written by American poets, whereas now people like Shadab are going back to using the form as it is, but in English. She's also gone back to the Qasida, and what she does is, when she uses these forms, is to explore history, particularly Muslim history, and so her recent Qasidas are set in Lahore, where she puts together Iqbal and other Islamic philosophers. So I think that's very new and that's very important. As far as other young poets are concerned, we had a poetry reading on Friday, and you will see that these young voices are very outspoken. They're not afraid to explore things like eroticism. They also explore themes which are around us, like, so even if you're not very political in nature, those things that are going on around you are bound to affect your poetry. So there is a lot of political poetry, which there was not, let's say, in the 70s. That was not so important. It was more the landscape and the people, whereas now it's much more urban. There's an urban metaphor. There is the idea of violence all around us. The forms are very modern. I would say that new poetry has, because people have the internet and are able to access literatures from all around the world, including those in translation, plus American poetry, that has changed the voice of poetry. It's much more compressed than it used to be. Before it was the English canon which was more dominant, and now it's English poetry from everywhere, really. So that again has changed the tone and voice.
Thank you. That was again really very interesting. Aroosa, can you tell us about your work and what you think where fiction is going?
Right. Well, I just see, Pakistani literature, and because I specialize in fiction, and second generation fictional writing, so I'll talk about that. For me, I think English literature Pakistani Anglophone literature has developed, and it has evolved over a period of time. If you just go back to 1947, or even if you just go back even back further, for example, you can see that there was the range of first generation writers who were talking about the partition narratives, and then yet another generation came who started talking of the first generation, started talking about the partition issues and the post-independence issues, and then there were some of the writers who talked about the diasporic experiences along with the problems faced by Pakistan during 70s and 80s. And then when it comes to the second generation writing, and particularly fictional writings, again, you can see a diversity among the second generation writers. For example, we do have a whole range of fiction that talks about 9/11 events and the repercussions, for example, of the 9/11 events, in the lives of the Pakistani Muslims at home and in the diaspora. And then there were, this retrospective prologues to the post 9/11 fiction, the kind of a category which I introduces in my book. Again, these are the novels that do not talk about 9/11 as such, but they actually talk about the indigenous problems like Islamization of Pakistan, blasphemy law, minority rights, ethnic and sectarian crisis, etc., which have contributed in one way or the other towards the negative image of Pakistan in the West. And then, as far as but of course, I don't see, because there was this boom of, post 9/11 fiction in the last decade, as I just said in my, yesterday's talk as well, which compelled some of the commentators to say that, probably this drama and the fire that this kind of fiction created, it would soon fizzle out and it would die out quickly, which is a very hasty conclusion, I think, with reference to our rich literary tradition. And then, if you just go along, that there are so many writers now who are writing very differently. They're not talking about 9/11 or the post 9/11 or even the post 9/11, but they are focusing on other issues. For example, we have Uzma Aslam Khan, who's talking about environmentalism, and her works can be read in relation to ecofeminism or eco-cosmopolitanism or environmentalism in general. Then we have Amir Hussain, who's not only sort of experimenting with the form. For example, he's writing in the Gothic tradition, but he is writing more in kind of folklore tradition too, which is a very different kind of thing that we had observed in the last decade. Then, we have writers such as Bilal Tanveer, who's again experimenting with the form, and he's not again talking about 9/11 or generally the Muslim identity crisis. He's more interested to sort of explore, the beauty and the violence in Karachi. So the whole notion of cityscape, an urban imaginary, that's being the focus of his work. And then again, we have writers like Bina Shah and Muhammad Hadif, who, for example, Bina Shah is the slum child, and Muhammad Hadif's Our Lady of Al-Asbati actually talks about the minority rights, which is very pertinent to, the contemporary human rights debate. So for me, Pakistani literature in English, and particularly Pakistani fiction, is evolving with the passage of time, and you can just, see them developing in stages. Yes, we had a decade of, partition and post-partition narratives, and then we have a decade of post-9/11 fiction, and now we have the whole decade where, these writers, they are engaging with more contemporary problems, which is the demand of the time. So they are not only experimenting with the themes, they are experimenting with the form. So I can, see, and they're contributing to this rich, literary tradition or canon.
Thank you very much for that overview, a very extensive body of work. Now, Kanza and Sophia, you have both recently published first novels. Can you tell us about your novels? We'll begin, I think, with Sophia, who's here, and then Kanza, who's, how did they evolve and what are they about, and how did you tackle them? And what is it to be a new author?
Well, I don't know how well I can speak to the being a new author overall, but my experience of it was such that, sorry, how's this? Better? Lift it. Is this better? Okay, sorry. I can only speak to my own experience of being a new author, of course. In my case, this book began with the first sentence, which I've come to realize is rather unusual, because ordinarily literature, or writing for me at least, does not necessarily begin at the beginning. It begins with the kernel of an idea. Kanza and I were discussing this earlier. How can you put your finger on the genesis of an idea when a book comes to be such a complex organism by the time you've finished with it? In my case, it was the first sentence of this book. It popped into my head and I went from there. But also germinating in my mind for a long time had been the idea of tragic romantic love and the impact that has on the non-players. So my novel Yasmin is about a young girl who embarks on a quest to find out what happened to her mother, Yasmin, who's been a participant in a classic tragic romantic love story. It examines the fallout of this love story and how it affects the family members, the friends, the other people involved in this story. And it tries to take a different look at a very classic sort of story. That was my ambition. I was very intrigued with the tragic romance, as many young girls are. But as I grew older, I came to see that it perhaps has more implications than are generally explored, which is what I was aiming to explore in my novel.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. I started writing my book 7 years ago. I was 17, so it kept changing its form and spirit over the years. I no longer have I don't have the recollection of when and how I really started this book. But for me, writing in English was a struggle, really, because Urdu was a language that was spoken at home. I dreamt in Urdu. I was more fluent in Urdu. I think I understood and started identifying with English in my undergraduate years when I started studying English literature. And I started reading South Asian literature, to be specific, started recognizing our own South Asian, Pakistani, indigenous and also diasporic writers. The book, for me, it started with a single solitary scene of a child who is trying to recognize herself after the death of her own grandfather. And slowly it started with a scene. I wasn't writing with the conviction that I'm going to write a book. I was very young. I was not friends with any writers. There were no writers in my family. I belonged to this middle upper class, scientists, engineers, business people. It was a really different sort of a sphere for me to enter into. Then slowly this idea of a child started to develop in my head. I started to pay attention to her own struggles, her pains, whatever she was telling. She had a name after a while. I gave birth to other characters all around her. They had their own stories. The book I wrote 7 years ago, even the book that the rough manuscript I submitted to the Tiber Jones South Asia Prize is so different than the final product that I have in my hands now. So I can't really, I think this is what I can say. You conceive a small idea, it develops, it has this snowball effect. You travel, you meet people, you have conversation with strangers, you pick on strange things, and then you integrate it, reality fused with wild imagination, and then you have what we call a novel.
Thank you very much. That actually kind of leads me into my next question, which is what in a multilingual society, some people are multilingual or fortunate enough to be in a multilingual society, what determines the choice of a creative language? And for Haris, who writes Urdu poetry and English poetry and is now doing English essays, what determines what you write in which language?
Thank you. You have asked me this question before, Muneeza Appa, and I've always answered you differently. Because, this is something that, I haven't been able to resolve. But to be honest, I think it is increasingly becoming a monolingual society, which it never was. We come from a multilingual tradition. There's nothing exotic at all about writing in more than one language, or there was nothing exotic at all, I'm sorry, in writing in more than one languages, except that bilingualism becomes a story when you write in English and a vernacular. Otherwise, there are so many writers in Pakistan who write in Punjabi and Urdu, who write in Sindhi and Urdu, who write in Saraiki and Punjabi and Urdu, for instance, or Pashto and Urdu. So I think there's a politics to it as well. And politics has I'm using the term sort of liberally and broadly. But how do you determine that? For instance, when I say that it is our tradition, if you start with, for instance, Mir. So Mir would write in both Urdu and Persian. Ghalib would write in both Urdu and Persian. Iqbal would write in Urdu, Persian and English. Iqbal hasn't really been very creative. I mean, he hasn't been a creative writer in English per se, but he has been a creative writer. Then, as we were discussing just before the program, that one of our giants, who's not really celebrated as much as he should be, Ahmad Ali, was perfectly bilingual, a fiction writer in both Urdu and English. And you're absolutely, I mean, before the event when we were discussing that, Muneeza Appa is absolutely right that he moved from Urdu to English, from writing from Urdu to English, like Amir Hussain has moved from English to Urdu, but neither Ahmad Ali nor Amir Hussain left writing in the other language. So in a way they moved, they did not move, but they actually expanded their means and the languages and the medium. What determines, I am not really sure, but once I really thought about it, and I still think that when I write in Urdu, and we have discussed that, then I carry a baggage. That baggage is amazing. I'm not complaining at all. But I'm rooted in a certain tradition, South Asian Indo-Muslim writing tradition. Now that South Asian Indo-Muslim writing tradition gets itself manifested, and one of the biggest languages for its manifestation is Urdu. So I carry that when I write in Urdu, without knowing, of course. But when I write in English, it is a language that we have acquired. As I said earlier, and I repeat myself for some of you who have joined later, that English is, I'm not questioning that at all, English is a Pakistani language now. It is one of the 10-15 major languages that we speak, and it is certainly, I mean, it connects us with the rest of the world, so it is more important than many other languages. But it is in some sense acquired. I mean, it is in some sense acquired even in households where it is spoken. That's why you would see people in Pakistan speaking to each other, to their children in English, but quoting from Faiz Ahmad Faiz. So that kind of a tension is there. So when I write in English, I do not carry a particular baggage. I mean, it is a language that I have, or we have acquired, and that liberates you in some sense also. You can write about subjects, on subjects which haven't really been discussed in Urdu, or haven't really been discussed in other languages in Pakistan. So I think that's how you gain or expand your writing. But I don't think it's a conscious decision. And it's a very strange thing that when I was in England, I wrote a series of poems on Karachi. And when I'm here in the last 1 year, all that I have written is in English. Whether it is essays or poetry.
That's it.
Being a critic, I was sort of interested to know that, the choice of your language, to what extent, it is informed by your target audience or your readership?
To be honest, when you're writing a poem, I mean, when I am writing a poem, I do not have any target audience. But when I'm writing an essay, or I'm writing something in prose, which is not fiction, of course, creative non-fiction included, so there is an audience in mind, not for poetry for me.
Did anyone have to, I mean, Kanza, you made a conscious decision to choose English.
I did.
Yes.
Even though, like I said, I dreamt and thought in Urdu, but I felt I could write well in English, and I wanted to do justice to my characters and to myself as a writer. But like Haris said, it is an acquired and adopted language, and there are moments in writing also when that streak emerges, when I realize that I'm deliberately, consciously trying to write in English. It's a struggle, it's an internal struggle.
I'd just like to add here that in my correspondences with various young English poets, or poets writing in English, most of them, like by and large, have told me that their understanding of poetic form comes from reading Urdu poetry or vernacular poetry. And this is across the board. So, you know, they grow up with the vernacular tradition, but they choose to write in English. And they may weave lines of Urdu, like Mina Malak Hussain, and Azka the other day read a poem. So, and Waqas Naeem also uses Urdu phrases in his English poems. But the understanding of form and meter come from Urdu poetry. So this was kind of a revelation for me.
Do you have anything to add, or was the English your strong language always?
English was my strong language always, so I don't really have much to contribute in this regard. But I do also think that when you're talking about choosing a language, it's very interesting to me because I didn't have that option. And when I write, for me, it's not so much of a struggle, it's not so much of us choosing the words, it's a celebration of the one language in which I am most fluent. So it's a very interesting dynamic to think about what language you're choosing your words from as you write.
I was just thinking that we are trained. When I say acquired, I think when you go to a certain kind of go through a certain kind of schooling, you are trained to think in a certain language, but you're not trained to feel in that language. So the relationship is that in English I started thinking first and feeling later. And in Urdu, the feelings came first, and then you start thinking in that language. I mean, if that makes sense. So there is a bit of a change in order there in the use of languages.
Yes. Well, there's one thing, we've been talking about it earlier, is that, English language fiction has become very big. We've got, and the writers in diaspora and here, we've got poetry, although it's not so well known, it's happening. We've got essays but English language drama in Pakistan doesn't seem to have taken off. It's all happening in the diaspora. It's all Hanif Qureshi and Ayub Khandin. Although the other day I was quite thrilled to discover in Lahore that there is a published poet called Usman Ali. I haven't yet read his work, but he has written and published 2 plays in English. But it hasn't. So I want to ask the panel, what is their opinion? Why has English language drama not really happened? I mean, except for 1 or 2 plays here and there. And Hanif's Dictator's Wives was such a huge success. So, anyone want to take that?
Well, I'm not sort of, very much into the theatre or dramatic art, but I mean, I think to me, probably because, and I might be wrong, and of course I would, like to hear what other panelists or specialists talk about this, but for me, I think theatre has not been a very serious genre in Pakistan, and I'm talking about this serious theatre. So that could be one of the reasons, and it will take time, that, when this genre develops and evolves in order to sort of deal with the, some of the important issues, and particularly it hasn't, come to the fore in English in language. Yes, I know that there are some, works that are being done in the Urdu language, but not in English. So I don't know, that probably because we've not been taking this genre more seriously, and that is why even the last decade was the decade of fiction rather than poetry, though we do have some very new voices, as you've already mentioned, Imtiaz Zakir or Shamshad Khan or, Muneeza Alvi. But yeah, not drama. And for me, it's just because probably we have not taken this genre very seriously.
Does anyone else have opinions on that?
I think there's also an economic aspect to consider, in that when we sit and we write a book or we write a poem, we are by ourselves in our room, and there is some expense associated with publishing, of course, but nothing like the staging of a drama, which involves a great many people, it involves a lot of effort, it involves community. So to take the risk of that expense, which is perhaps a bit cynical, but to expend so much money on something, you have to know that it's going to succeed. Like even when you look at avant-garde theatre of the mid-20th century, Brecht or Ionesco or something like that, most people on a Saturday night would rather see A Midsummer's Night Dream than Waiting for Godot or something like that. So I think it's not only Pakistan, I think it's global. So that's...
Mr. Khalique, comment on that. I'd like to hear you. After.
Anyone? Yes?
I don't have much to add except that, there have been a lot of adaptations of blockbusters for the stage, but really no interest in serious drama like you mentioned, Sophia, and possibly because nobody's going to take the interest to actually, have that production done because there's not enough interest from the community itself.
Well, actually, I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. But I think there is an impact of Hindi film industry and Pakistani Urdu teleplays also a lot on English drama not being developed. But I tend to agree with what Sophia said, that it needs, you need so much to stage a play, and plays are written for for being watched, not to be read or not to be listened to. I mean, there are some fascinating plays which you can read also and enjoy, but essentially it has to be staged and performed. And in Pakistan, after the Communist Party of Pakistan in the 1950s, the other thing that took the brunt of power of the state was theatre and serious theatre. And there's some body of knowledge available, but it needs to be investigated also. So theatre did not develop in Urdu either. I mean, the way it has developed across the border in India, the natak, from street theatre to full costume plays, it's very different in India. And here it hasn't really been developed because it is a public display of what you write and what you think and what you perform. So and it is a direct conversation between art and power, and very immediate conversation between art and power. And it was not easy for people here in Pakistan. So economically, it is not feasible. I mean, I agree. Coming to think of it.
Well, actually, that makes me remember something else, because in the 19th century, the British passed some dramatic something act about censoring drama, and after independence, that act has been repealed in India and it's been repealed in Bangladesh, but not in Pakistan. And as far as I know, every script when you do a play, I think the script has to go to some censor. And a friend of mine wrote a play. It was a spoof, and she had the word. There was something about barrels, and they cut that out. And she said, "Why?" He said, "Well, barrels of a gun." So she said, "No, I meant barrels, containing liquid." So you get that kind of absurdity. So maybe that is also an impediment. Well, I mean, we have. I wanted to also ask what this interaction with, or is it an interaction when you are, like Harris has been to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and Sophia is now shortlisted for this Commonwealth Prize, and Kanza was shortlisted for the Tiber Jones. How do these awards and these creative writing programs, I don't know if Aroosa, have you taken part in, have you been involved in one of these sort of foreign sponsored programs? I don't know. I mean, I went to the Cambridge seminar, which was tremendous, but I wondered how you feel that's going to impact, or has it impacted, Pakistani English literature?
Writing is a very solitary craft. You spend hours and hours in isolation, but there's a whole world that's waiting for you out there. Agents, publishers, these competitions, and so many other readers and writers that one should interact with instead of staying in a cocoon for a long period of time. For me, Tiber Jones was really an eye-opener. I was very unsure of what I was doing. I didn't have anybody with whom I could share my manuscript with. I was not friends with any critics or writers. None of my friends really understood the creative and writing process. So what Tiber Jones did was, it gave me an insight into how writing, what the craft of writing really demands and requires, and the kind of courage and resistance and everything, rejections, acceptances, how to send out a manuscript to an agent, how to meet a publisher, and all these things. Also, it helped me befriend, let's say, other writers, and also attend other literary festivals and all these things. Writing seems a bit more easier when it comes to socializing and talking about your book. And Tiber Jones gave me that confidence and courage to go out there and talk about what I've written. Would you like to talk about that?
I think you can't underestimate the importance of interacting and engaging with other writers. I think as a writer, everything that happens to us in some way can influence our work. The smallest thing can prove deeply symbolic in the next thing we write. But it's also valuable to talk and engage with other writers because it's a very, very isolating experience, and people don't really understand what you're doing unless they're doing it themselves as well. And you can always gain insight or advice or some sort of influence from reading, but also from speaking to people, because everyone's processes are different. When I was doing my MFA, I learned the importance of dialogue, which was something I had deeply, deeply underestimated. But it was only through talking to other writers that I realized that this is something in contemporary fiction that is very deeply valued. And I'd been reading much older fiction at the time, so I hadn't realized how vital something as simple as dialogue is. So just that's a small example of how engaging with other writers can have an enormous impact on your own work.
Anyone else?
Well, I think the person who decided to send me to Iowa is sitting in the audience. I mean, Shahid Wasim Saab is here. He thought that I should go and spend time in Iowa because, then Pakistan will be better for a few months. On a serious note, the International Writing Program in University of Iowa gave me the opportunity to, the one that, I was able to finish the draft of my 4 long essays, which I was making notes to finish for quite some time, and I was not really, because of my clerical sort of job and engagements here in Pakistan. So that gave me that opportunity. I mean, that was prime, as Kanza was saying, that it is a solitary thing. So I decided to lock myself in the room for a month and finish the draft. So that was very important. But the other thing is that I was able to understand and appreciate what is happening in 30 other contemporary, 30 other languages, contemporary writing in 30 other languages, which is an amazing opportunity because you spend a whole semester, the fall semester, with writers from 30, 35, 25 other countries, and that is an amazing experience. So for instance, we would, if somebody asks me that what are you reading, what have you read in Spanish, so I would say Gabriel Garcia, and that's the max. I mean in terms of contemporary writing, or a few others, or Lorca and Neruda in terms of poetry. So you get to know what is your contemporaries writing, thinking and experimenting with when you go to such programs. One is that. And finally, I must share, and it is rather unfortunate, that there haven't really been many Urdu writers or writers, leave alone writers in other Pakistani languages who get the opportunity to get exposed to such opportunities of learning and such events and such workshops. So I think that is where the linguistic divide also needs to be filled, and more writers who write in Urdu or other Pakistani languages but can understand and communicate in English should be sent to these programs. Thank you.
Well, that's really nice. I mean, that's a very good point.
Can I say something? I haven't had the opportunity to be on a residency or a writing program, but I do understand, like, I've mostly worked in isolation. And when I worked as an instructor on the Desi Writers Lounge poetry workshop, I came to understand how very important that is, because the young poets would write a poem, they would critique each other's work before the instructors critiqued it. And I think that was wonderful because there were so many points which were raised. Some were very common with what the instructor said and some weren't. But there was this whole, it was like a community where you could discuss each other's work and you could also refer to other writers. And so it opens up your horizons enormously. And I'm talking just about an online thing. Forget about actual, interaction where you are living together or sitting together. So, that can't be denied.
Thank you. Any more comments? No? Well, I'm going to open it out to the audience. Any questions? A question here, yes. There's a question here and a question there.
I ask this question as a layperson because I'm no expert on literature, and the author that I want to ask that question about is also not here, but during the discussion when you are writing thinking and feeling in one language and writing in that same language, but what comes first was the remark made by Mr. Haris Khalique. The feeling that I have when I read Nadeem Aslam is that he writes in English, but the tradition that he is, the manner he writes it in, for me, is very, very, the style of Urdu literature. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, do you have anything to say on that, Kanza, Aroosa?
I don't understand, like, in what ways you just say that, his writing or his style resembles more like him in Urdu literature?
I think it's very lyrical.
Yeah. Yeah, he is descriptive. Yeah, he is descriptive. He's very descriptive in his fiction. But I think the creative writers will probably be in a better position to comment on the choice of this style.
I think you mean the kind of romantic lyricism that his work has. And if you talk about contemporary Pakistani fiction and postmodern fiction, we don't add that necessary details, that Victorian elegance when it comes to language and all those things, but
well, he has a very strong Urdu background.
Yes, because he grew up until his teens.
That's his first language.
Yeah.
Another language you think first. So, I mean,
Haris would like to respond to that.
Dr. Saiba, I think it is language is incidental. We can dissect it, keep going about it. I think it is the sensibility, which perhaps Nadeem Aslam's sensibility is very Pakistani, stroke South Asian. So it's not perhaps merely about the form, but the sensibility.
Yes, please.
Is this on? Yeah. My question is for Ilona and Haris Khalique. I know that you're producing, journals and all, but then again, when it comes to poetry, the readership becomes really limited because they're getting published in journals. The other problem is that publishers are not really interested in publishing poetry. Rizwan Akhtar is a poet. He's in Lahore, Punjab University. He writes beautiful poetry, but he just cannot convince publishers to publish his collection. So how do we get over this stumbling block?
I'm not published. I'm only published in literary journals abroad, and that really hurts me. I have been that's like about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And thereafter I've been fairly widely published in journals abroad, but it hurts me that I think for a poet you need to have some kind of, it's not even recognition, it's about being heard locally, because that's where you come from. And there is a total lack of publishing houses here. Nobody's interested even. Forget about a collection of poetry. An anthology would be good enough, in which there's even 10 poets or 5 poets. Even that is not there. So it's very frustrating because you kind of, even if you're interacting with other poets, you are constantly isolated.
Just go online. You have that opportunity which your predecessors did not have. There are no publishers. There are no poetry, even small niche publishers for poetry. You wouldn't find any in Pakistan. My publishing. I've got friends who are rich, and who are into publishing business. Some of them, so to be honest, I mean, Urdu has a different scene in Pakistan. How much we lament, but it is you find serious publishers in Urdu. But for English, even there are no publishers for fiction in Pakistan. Oxford University Press, for instance, is a serious academic publisher, or memoirs or textbooks and stuff. But there are no publishers in Pakistan. So self-publishing, perhaps, I mean, going online is better than you can also go print hard copies out. But I would say that we need to think about it, and that's why journals are important, and that's why the breakthrough came when very graciously Muneeza Shamsie Sahiba picked my 2 poems up to be included in A Dragonfly in the Sun, 50 Years of Pakistani Writing in English. And after that, it became easier.
Well, I shouldn't be too kind of down in the mouth, because there are, as I mentioned, 2 online portals, and they have done instrumental work. And they are now in print, both the Missing Slate and Desi Writers Lounge. But having said that, I think we need publishers also to take an interest. For the moment, then all you have to do, and which is happening in poetic circles, that people are gathering in small groups, and I think maybe for poetry that is the way to go, because it doesn't get public recognition. So getting together as small groups is a good thing, and that is happening. That's happening here, and it's happening in Lahore. I'm not familiar with Karachi, but it's certainly happening in both Lahore and Islamabad.
But we should have publishers.
I think we have time for one more question, do we? Yes. There's some question back there.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Arslan Awan from International Islamic University, and I have a question that why Pakistani writers use more diasporical elements in their writing? Why did stress on diasporical element, and which type of writing barrier they faces?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part. Which part of the writing? Can you repeat it, please, but a little slower, yeah?
Diasporical elements and writing barriers. Why Pakistani writers stress more on diasporical element in their writing?
Why do they have more metaphorical writing?
Diasporic elements in their writing. Why do Pakistani English writers?
You talk about it.
I think I've just said in the... Yeah,
yes, please,
I don't think that all writers actually focus on the diaspora or the thematic foci or the problems that are associated with the diasporics in general. As I've just said to you, that many writers are focusing on the indigenous problems, including Muhammad Hanif, Aslam Khan, Bilal Tanveer, Bina Shah. So no, if you just explore Pakistani writings in general, you'll find many writers, even in the last decades, who have focused on the indigenous problem, the problems that are relevant to us as Muslims and as Pakistanis, in the 21st century. So no, I think that you need to sort of explore it a bit and just go and read the other writers, and you'll feel that no, they're not basically focusing on diaspora.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up. I think, yes, they're getting very agitated, so I'm sorry. But thank you all very much, and thank you to the panel and to the audience. Thank you.